Today's video is about a rather interesting experiment I carried out to determine two things. One is whether this 15-year-old Dell workstation is worth the effort and money to turn it into a modern budget-friendly gaming/productivity computer. I will discuss the upgrades and changes I made, the hardware and software challenges I encountered during this process, and finally which modern games and applications the computer could run. The other is whether Microsoft and Riot games were justified in rendering this aging system obsolete and why they won't be happy with what I found. Our guest today is the T3500, a model that emerged from the bottom line of Dell's Precision series, launched in 2009, commonly available on eBay today for between $50 and $80. A very solid and reliable workstation, but definitely not suited for gaming. Not yet. Considering its first impressions, with the ample amount of interesting yet outdated external characteristics, it's clear that the T3500 was designed to meet the demands of a past era. Nevertheless, I am not ready to abandon it to its gloomy fate just yet, so let's pop the hood of this old machine and discover what lies inside. The first thing we encountered is a massive hinged contraption that swings out to hold the storage devices and ends up covering a big chunk of the system. It was great for easy drive swapping back in the day, but in this case it really got in the way, which you will clearly see as the story unfolds. Meanwhile, underneath it lies an unusually large motherboard, unusual at least in comparison to typical ATX models, which it undoubtedly deters any thoughts of fitting this into a standard ATX PC case. Not a big deal, as the design of this workstation is quite fascinating. Take for example the chassis, which is just another fancy way to say PC case. It can be oriented both as a tower or as a tank. Sorry, I meant as a desktop. But be cautious, this thing has the same weight as a blue Olympic plate. Great for your warm-up sessions, but not so great if you need to move it around frequently. Now let's take a closer look at the motherboard, the component that connects all the computer parts together. There are some very unusual stuff inside, like this internal USB 2.0 port. Why anyone would want a USB port inside their PC case is beyond me. Then again, we have some very old components, such as these PCI Express 2.0 slots, and this white PCI slot, one of which is occupied with a FireWire expansion card, or this vintage floppy disk drive connector. There are also some very proprietary components, like this front panel connector that controls several essential functions, such as the button to start the computer. This is another reason why you cannot replace the Dell PC case with a regular ATX one. Here, by removing this blue shroud, you will be able to see the two front fan headers, which have a distinct design compared to the typical ones. That's why if you try to swap out those two loud front fans for aftermarket options, you will have to hunt down specific adapters or engage in some peculiar shenanigans to get those new fans spinning. Even then, the BIOS will throw a bunch of annoying error messages every time you boot the system, so it's a big no-no. But there is more. Beneath this aluminum heatsink, we find the X58 chipset that powers the motherboard. This means we have access to not just Xeons, but the entire Intel CPU lineup that supports socket 1366, including the unlocked Intel i7 variants. Unfortunately, the T3500 contains a BIOS that offers only very basic features regarding high-tier functionality. There are no overclocking or other advanced options that the equivalent aftermarket X58 motherboards provide. I will say, typically if you buy a workstation. Since we are discussing Intel processors, under this pile of aluminum rests a Xeon X5550, a 4-core 8-thread relic compared to today's standards, with poor IPC and very slow speeds. The perfect excuse to upgrade to one of the top available choices for this platform, an Intel W3680. This CPU utilizes more advanced lithography, features 6 cores and 12 threads, contains a larger cache, which is essentially the processor's internal memory, and operates at higher clock frequencies. That's a lot more speed and power, but with great power comes overheating. The DTP or thermal design power of the original X5550 CPU is 95 watts, indicating that the current cooling solution isn't designed for anything more powerful than the original CPU. Therefore, I needed to switch to a more advanced CPU cooler. Beyond the space limitations that the hard drive tray was already imposing, choosing any contemporary solution would entail the hassle of incompatibility. Therefore, I opted for the safest route and purchased the best available official option from Dell. I also throw in an extra fan to ensure my peace of mind. Nonetheless, and in spite of my best intentions, the W3680 became toasty during gaming sessions and immediately crashed under stress testing. So I bought another Intel processor, the Xeon X5675, which has nearly identical specifications to the W3680, although with slightly reduced frequencies. On the other hand, it has a higher thermal tolerance than the other two Xeons, and the identical TTP as the X5550, which means, at least in theory, the old heatsink will work just fine with this latest and hopefully final Xeon purchase for this project. Foreshadowing? We will find out soon enough if that prediction was correct. Since this motherboard supports up to 24GB, I decided to max out the system RAM, so I purchased these 3 extra DDR3 memory modules of 4GB each, running at the very slow, by today's standards, 1333 megatransfers per second. Let's hope that the increased bandwidth provided by the activated triple memory channel will somewhat mitigate the slow RAM frequencies. Just keep in mind that this motherboard only supports memory modules designated with the letters E or U. The first is ECC unregistered memory, which detects and corrects data errors, offering better reliability. The letter U refers to the typical memory modules used in desktop computers. Both PC 10600E and U types of RAM can be found these days at very low prices. Bear in mind that you cannot mix the two together. Since we talk about internal memory, atop this cursed tray rests an aged 250GB Western Digital hard disk drive, which I complemented with an SSD drive to set up the operating system, games, and most applications, keeping the old hard disk drive for backup purposes. What I didn't keep was this old and powerless Quadro FX 580 GPU, which I replaced with this Asus Radeon RX 570, considered a very good match for the Xeon X5675. Obviously, it's not going to blow you away with 4K Ultra settings, but it is definitely somewhat capable for low to medium 1080p gaming. The only problem with this plan was the hard disk drive tray that stuck its nose in my business one too many times. So we had to take separate paths. Out you go, and here we have a cheap 5¼ to 3.5 inch drive bay caddy. Exactly what we need to install the storage devices in it. A small tip here is to place the SSD data cable where the old hard disk drives was. It will save you time with a few BIOS configurations. Last but not least was the power supply unit. Even though it seemed to be in good condition and powerful enough to sustain our system, it is quite old. It provides only a single 6-pin PCI connector, which limits any future attempts to upgrade to a more powerful GPU. Moreover, I don't know the background of this part, so I cannot trust it. Therefore, I sold it along with the included cables. For some reason, these units are quite easy to sell in the used market. I replaced it with one of my old but reliable Corsair units that I kept as a backup in my storage. It has many different types of connectors and delivers 650 watts, ensuring adequate support for future upgrades. And since we no longer live in 2009, I occupied one of the many empty PCI Express slots with this USB 3.0/USB-C expansion card. Modernity and retro blend in a single package. The only thing that remains now is to press the power button, configure a few things in the BIOS, install an operating system, and check if all this was worth the effort or if it was a complete waste of time and money. Just an important note, although it is possible to install Windows 11 on this old machine, I would suggest install something else. I will mention why down the road. I began the gaming benchmarks with the Java edition of Minecraft. At 1080 resolution, 12 chunks and fancy graphics with the Optifine mode enabled, the game ran spectacularly well if you ignore the initial stuttering while the map was still rendering the world. That's the only reason for that huge frame gap between average and 1% lows, which printed out 636 and 28 FPS respectively. I doubled down on the massive popular games with testing the GTA 5, which resulted in some very impressive numbers considering that the system is 6 years older than the game itself. At 1080p with everything set to high, I got an average of 91 frames and 56 lows. Fortnite, as always, produced some initial stutters during the first 3 to 5 minutes of gameplay. This phenomenon is related to the game engine itself, not the hardware. However, after the bumpy start, the overall experience was quite pleasing, and the average of 170 along with the 83 FPS and 1% lows reflects that. There was also some very odd numbers regarding GPU utilization, but more on that in a bit. For now, let's focus on the next game that under normal circumstances shouldn't run at all. I will explain it in a bit as well. Nevertheless, the 2 hours of gameplay made it clear that Valorant at 1080 and mostly high settings will not only run, but it will perform quite well considering the average frames always stay above the low 100s and the 1% lows meet the mandatory 60. Lowering the graphic settings will produce a few more frames per second, but it's not enough of an improvement to justify the trade-off. If you thought that booting up Valorant was a lucky coincidence, then take a look at Riot's biggest title, League of Legends. Here I will expect higher frames, but considering the sky-high graphic settings and the fact that I was testing the system under some very heavy rendering scenarios, the final 89 and 55 average and 9% lows respectively weren't shabby at all. Again, similar to Valorant, switching to low settings will not boost the performance by much, a clear indication that the CPU is the limiting factor here, and something that will explain that on both games I witnessed again this erratic GPU utilization. A trend that also continued in Counterstrike 2 at 1080p low settings and FSR at ultra quality. Regardless, the overall performance was fine by me, even though the average of 61 and 41 frames in 1% lows aren't suitable for competitive play. So far, I speculate that the erratic fluctuations in GPU utilization are due to CPU limitations, and not a type of hardware malfunction, as most of these PC components have been tested on a second motherboard and worked just fine. Despite this, I bought and installed a new PSU to eliminate any doubt from my mind that this issue might be caused by the power supply unit. And I was correct because the inconsistent GPU utilization continued, mainly in live service games and lightweight titles. Before I move on to some more demanding PC games that push the T3500 to its limits, I also had to test one more free-to-play game. Marvel Rivals was the most demanding of the bunch so far. The only way I found to keep the frame rates at acceptable levels on this fast-paced shooter without completely sacrificing the visual fidelity was to play in windowing mode at 720p and low settings. Even that wasn't enough to keep the frames above 52 on average, while the lows barely reached 30 FPS. Honestly, I can't find any legitimate reason why this title runs so poorly, considering that the graphics aren't far superior to those of the eSport titles I've tested so far. Meanwhile, AAA titles such as Cyberpunk 2077 will produce more or less the same frame rates at higher resolutions and low settings, and the graphics definitely look much better than Marvel Rivals. This is a testament that game optimization is as important as creating a game, unless you are a lazy developer who doesn't care about making a huge amount of computer hardware obsolete. On the other hand, Baldur's Gate 3, despite the rumors that Act 3, the low city area, is a CPU killer, so the Xeon X5675 passed the test with flying colors, since the main limiting factor was the graphics card and not the CPU. BG3 is a slow-paced game, making the 43 average and 26 in 1% lows relevant only for measurement purposes, that they don't correlate much with the overall gameplay experience, which actually wasn't bad. Here is the benchmark of one more recent demanding title. Black Myth Wukong at 1080p low settings and TSR at 67% will render some very nice scenes while keeping the frame rate in the low 40s. Definitely this performance doesn't win any awards, but if the fact that a 2009 computer can run a heavy 2024 game is not impressive, I don't know what is. And if you think Black Myth Wukong is too much for this old system, then here it is, the somewhat older Elden Ring at 1080 resolution and a mix of max high and medium settings. Of course, the 55 average along the 29 lows induces quite a bit of screen tearing on a 60Hz monitor, but it isn't something that a frame cap wouldn't resolve. Meanwhile, for those who would like to resurrect their game console library, this refurbished T3500 is quite a catch. Obviously, if you want PS3 or Xbox emulation, you will have to make some compromises, mainly running lightweight titles at lower resolutions and settings. But anything from PlayStation 2 or Nintendo Wii and earlier will run with ease. Moreover, the T3500's legacy hardware, such as the DVD optical drive, the native PCI slots, the floppy disk connector, etc., makes it a great candidate for the legacy operating systems and a good choice for building a retro gaming setup. Of course, you don't own a computer just to play video games. This system will cover a vast spectrum of tasks, from video and audio editing to CAD modeling, programming, and various rendering tasks, although it will need its time. Don't expect to beat modern systems. This is at least what I could interpret by analyzing the results of the productivity and synthetic benchmarks. The only issue I found here is the difficulty of running PC and 3D Mark. I managed to execute only the latter of the two former benchmarking suites by uninstalling the system info, which interfered with Dell's eccentric thermal and fan speed sensors. Talking about thermals, with an ambient temperature of 21 degrees Celsius, the CPU was on the hot side, reaching at worst case scenario 87 degrees while running heavy CPU stress tests, and a maximum of 84 degrees while gaming. Nothing major to be concerned about, considering it is 12 degrees from the X5670's limit and that it operates with passive CPU cooling, meaning without a fan. This means that you should avoid using applications such as throttle stop to consistently push the CPU frequencies to their maximum levels. And here is one more tip on how to gain a free 5% performance boost in some games. Download and run an app called Inspector that removes spectre and meltdown protections, which cause a few slowdowns in older CPUs. And no, the chances of getting hacked by doing this are very slim unless you are building a server. Overall, I'm genuinely surprised by how well this 15-year-old Dell machine responded to my tests. Despite being based on a very old platform and having quite a few hardware limitations, its upgradability is adequate enough to play anything at 1080p resolution, especially if you install a beefier graphics card than the one I used in this video. From my perspective, an RX 570 is a good match for the Xeon X5675, but that doesn't mean you can't consider, for example, an RX 580, a GTX 1070, or even an RTX 2070 or an RX 5700. At this point, however, you will start to see diminishing returns due to the heavy CPU bottleneck and will affect the price-to-performance ratio that this build is all about. But there's another layer to this project that I feel obligated to discuss, a matter more significant than everything I have mentioned so far in this video. Perhaps it is something that Microsoft, along with Riot, wouldn't want you to know about, since it has nothing to do with the physical components of this PC, but everything to do with their software. You see, back in 2021, when Microsoft launched Windows 11, they decided to make mandatory two controversial requirements. One is the TPM 2.0, Trusted Platform Module version 2, and the secure boot functions. The other is the compatibility with processors built on architectures newer than the Zen Plus or Kaby Lake. That means hundreds of thousands of otherwise quite capable computers are now unsupported by Microsoft's new operating system. To make matters worse, Riot, the company behind Valorant and League of Legends, decided to enforce also a mandatory requirement for their anti-cheat engine, which involves enabling TPM 2.0 and secure boot. Essentially, this move blocked thousands of users from their favorite games, forcing them in a way to buy a new computer or play something else. Someone might ask, since when is it wrong for companies to set higher requirements if it means delivering better products, services, or making their software more secure? And the answer is, no one is saying it's wrong. It is the approach they chose to take that's the problem. First, Windows 11 isn't so much of an upgrade compared to its predecessor. And the truth is that the minimum hardware requirements are still minimal, thus including virtually any PC built after 2008. The real problem is the TPM 2.0 function, which supposedly adds another layer of protection against unauthorized access to your system. More specifically, the TPM and secure boot creates a key at the boot process when your computer starts. This encrypted key is unique based on the characteristics of your computer. Basically, TPM will protect you from someone that will have physical access to your home, office, or wherever your computer or laptop is, which in this case means you have more important things to protect than just your personal sensitive data from being stolen. Do you know what TPM will not protect you from? It will not protect you from the usual stuff, like system security holes, software bugs, and internet malware, or viruses, or clicking, downloading, and running things that you shouldn't run in the first place. And the reality is, unless you are some kind of Prime Minister or 00 agent, you don't need the TPM function.
You finished?
Yes.
Good.
Most people who use Microsoft Windows to play video games, read their emails, browse the internet, and do shopping therapy have been relatively safe doing so all these years without any TPM or secure boot implementation. So Microsoft, instead of addressing their operating system's vulnerabilities, decided to tech block hundreds of thousands of users. And do you know what the funny thing is? Microsoft recently had to slightly change their draconian wording on the Windows 11 installation policy by uploading a guide on their official site on how to install Windows 11 on unsupported processors. Well, how about that? Of course, they constantly remind you at every step why you shouldn't do that, and if something bad happens to your PC, it isn't their responsibility, and yada yada. I think what really happened is that after 3 years since the launch of Windows 11, Microsoft realized that most users are still sticking with Windows 10. Despite all the intimidating announcements about Windows 10 reaching its end of life in October of 2025 and countless sales pitch for subscription-based services, it seems like Microsoft now is trying to lure people into upgrading to Windows 11 with the above half-baked clutch. Even so, they don't guarantee ongoing security support, and any major OS update will require users to manually reinstall Windows. My personal experience installing Windows 11 on the Dell T3500 wasn't ideal either. Trying the installation from a USB device proved impossible. I encountered a black screen even with the assistance of tools like Rufus. I had to install Windows 10 first and then Windows 11, only to face a buggy system updater and significant slowdowns. Thus, I jumped back to Windows 10. So, are there other options? Yes, there are. One is the path I chose. The other option is asking a Windows user to switch to Linux, which is kind of like asking an omnivore to go vegan overnight. There's also the Riot situation, where they took Microsoft's brilliant idea and used it to secure their online games. While they might have seen some success by doing so, They've also managed to alienate a lot of their loyal player base. Valorant and League of Legends are among the games that can run at high frame rates on low performing systems. As a result, people with budget computers were able to enjoy these games until Riot made TPM 2.0 and Secure Boot mandatory, even on Windows 10. Now, those players can no longer access their favorite games. But it's not because Valorant moved to Unreal Engine 5 and now requires a more powerful PC to run. It's not because League of Legends got major visual upgrades that would justify a hardware upgrade. No. It's because Riot is either too lazy or too incompetent to come up with a less intrusive way to protect its IP, choosing instead to induce hardware obsolescence by misusing features that were never meant to serve as hardware-level digital rights management. Is there a solution to this? Oh yeah, the fact that I was able to play Valorant and League of Legends on this old system proves it. Am I going to tell you how I did it? Of course not. I like my channel the way it is, so I can keep uploading content. What I did was purely for educational purposes, not something that I felt to share. But here's the thing. There's more than one way to solve this problem. The truth is out there. If you search for it, I am sure you will find it. Just don't ask me about it. I will plead the fifth. Obviously, the decisions made by Microsoft and Riot raise more serious concerns, particularly around the right to repair movement. This movement advocates for consumers' ability to fix and upgrade their own devices, highlighting how these companies push people into buying new ones instead. Moreover, from an environmental standpoint, reusing and upgrading old hardware to keep it compatible with modern software is crucial for reducing electronic waste, an issue that continues to grow and is definitely overlooked. Asking the average person to become tech-savvy and figure out solutions to problems created by multi-million-dollar companies just because they don't give a duck about planet's environment is not a sustainable path for anyone. What's truly sustainable is this old but gold Dell workstation I've turned into a modern multitasking machine. Of course, there are trade-offs. You won't be running the latest games at high resolutions and max settings, no matter which upgrade path you choose. But as you've watched, you will still be able to play everything, even if it is at cinematic frame rates, spending a fraction of what a new gaming rig will cost you today. This makes me wonder, will you ever consider taking on such a project, and how much will you spend on it? If you've already done something like this, what model of pre-built computer did you upgrade and what kind of strengths and limitations did you encounter? Let me know in the comments below, along with your thoughts on the other topics discussed in this video. And for those of you who prefer to watch rather than comment, here are some more of my videos that might interest you.